Working in a place like this suits a poor, a familyless guy like you, sneered my classmate Bill Walker as he saw me working at the convenience store. But the next moment, the sound of a slap echoed through the quiet store. Apologize to him right now. It was his father who had been bullying me, showing anger to his son. Knowing the reason why, I started to tear up. My name is Michael Edwards. Ever since I lost my parents in an accident when I was a child, since I have no relatives, I've had to switch schools multiple times over the years. I was bounced around from relative to relative. At each relative's house, I was treated kindly at first, but it seems that raising someone else's child is always challenging. When it was time to move to the next house, they would send me off happily saying, "Take care." I was never told, "You're always welcome back." Through these many moves, I learned how to live without causing trouble for others. In junior high, 8th grade, for some reason, I ended up living with a couple in their 50s, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. Both Mr. and Mrs. Wilson are qualified lawyers and were busy working as lawyers until a few years ago. Now they're both retired and living peacefully. I didn't know why they took me in, as I was not a relative or anything. Regardless of the reason, I wanted to stay here forever. Because this town is where I lived with my parents until they died in the accident. Walking down the street, warm memories come flooding back. I wonder how long I'll be allowed to stay with the Wilsons. Reflecting on my past, I vowed to live quietly and cause as little trouble as possible until the time comes to leave. Contrary to my thoughts, the Wilsons were very kind and treated me like a real family. "Michael, let's go fishing together." "Michael, what do you want for dinner tonight?" I hadn't had such conversations since my parents passed away. I remembered that a real family was something this warm. And so I gradually opened up to Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. In 9th grade, Mr. Wilson asked my future plans. "After I graduate from middle school, I plan to work. So please let me stay here a little longer until I can stand on my own 2 feet. I didn't hesitate to show my intent to get a job. "We consider you, Michael, as part of our real family. You can always stay here, and you don't have to worry about money. Take the time seriously to think about your future." The kindness of Mr. Wilson was overflowing. It was a very heartwarming statement, but I, who had never thought about the future before, was left puzzled. All I had been thinking about was how to become independent as quickly as possible so as not to burden to others. I didn't have a clear idea about what I wanted to do or what I liked. Seeing my struggle and envisioning my future, Mr. Wilson said with a smile, "What you need, Michael, is time to face yourself. If you want to go to high school, do so. If you want to work, then get a part-time job. If you want to study, then study hard. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson always consider me." Helped pave the way for my future by letting me go to high school. Upon entering high school, I ran into a guy named Bill. Bill was a classmate from elementary school. We were not in the same class back then, so we hardly ever spoke. However, once we ended up in the same class in high school, Bill began to make sarcastic remarks and bully me. Bill belonged to a popular group and gradually began to involve others in his antics against me. Being an orphan, I had been subjected to this sort of harassment at school for a long time, so I knew better than to engage with him. He would get bored and give up eventually. Deciding to ignore him, I found Bill constantly trying to mess with me. My stress was piling up. Thus, my high school life, far from smooth, had begun. About a month after starting high school, Mr. Wilson asked me about my school life. "It's fun, Mr. Wilson. Thank you for letting me go to high school." I'm determined never to tell them about Bill's harassment, because I don't want to worry Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. I had decided that once I became a high school student, I would take advantage of the time that Mr. and Mrs. Wilson had given me to try various things. I wanted to discover my own potential. And to repay Mr. and Mrs. Wilson in some way, I thought of getting a part-time job at a convenience store. The reason was that I thought I should earn at least my pocket money myself, and I thought I could meet various people at a convenience store. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were genuinely pleased for this. I had lived a reserved life, always wary of how others would react, so I was worried if I could handle customer service. But surprisingly, I was able to handle it smoothly. As for my coworkers, there were college students, housewives, and a 65-year-old man. Listening to their various stories, I realized that what I had experienced so far was just a tiny fraction of life. They all said in unison, "Once you enter society, most people have to live a constrained life because of their company or societal expectations, so do whatever you like while you can." Advice from those more experienced in life carries a weight. I believe I've certainly grown a lot since I started my part-time job. At one point, a high school girl named Jenna became a new member of our coworkers. Jenna was a quiet girl, but we quickly became friends because we were the same age, lived close by, and had the same way home. One of the things I enjoyed was talking with Jenna on the way home from work. I was usually the one talking, but Jenna was a good listener and occasionally made sharp retorts. It was a lot of fun being with her. I used to live here. I stopped and pointed to a place that is now vacant. Really? Jenna looked surprised, her face serious. I told her about how my parents had died in a car accident when I was in the first grade, how I had transferred schools over and over again, and how I was now living in this town again, taken in by a kind couple. Jenna thought for a while before looking straight into my eyes and saying, "I'm glad you came back to this town, Michael." I didn't think too deeply about the meaning of her words. I was just happy. One day during a break, Bill came up to the front of my desk. "Your parents died in an accident, didn't they? They probably ignored a traffic signal or something. People who can't follow rules deserve to die. And now you're freeloading, right? You've been passed around by your relatives, and then you're taken in by people who aren't even relatives. That's definitely suspicious. They're probably going to make you do something bad, right? Man, your life is a mess." Bill said this with a smirk, loudly enough that everyone could hear. I had ignored him when he bothered me before, but this time I couldn't. I was angry when he spoke ill of my parents and the couple, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. Don't talk nonsense when you don't know anything. Before I knew it, I was grabbing Bill. "Michael, you should calm down." My friend stopped me, and I came back to myself, shaking my fist and taking deep breaths. The classroom was silent. Bill, surprised by my first retaliation. "What are you doing? It's the truth." Bill spat that out and returned to his seat. I managed to suppress my anger, grabbed my bag, and left the classroom. It's too early to go home. I sat down on the riverbank, staring blankly at the river. The chirping of birds, the flowing water, the sound of grass rubbing against the wind. Ordinary life was passing right before my eyes. I used to take walks here with my mom and dad. Memories of the past resurfaced. The memories from when my parents were alive are only of happy times. Catching bugs together, setting off fireworks, making birthday cakes. I wonder what kind of person I would have become if my parents were alive. I tried to think about it, but I stopped right away. How many hours have I been sitting here? The sun that was directly above me was now shining on me from the right. I guess it's time to go home. I had completely regained my composure. Returned to the house where Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were waiting. "I'm home." "Welcome back, Michael. Can we talk for a moment?" Mrs. Wilson, who had come to meet me, said, Following Mrs. Wilson in the living room, I saw Mr. Wilson sitting on the sofa. "I'm home." "Welcome back, Michael. We got a call from your teacher before noon saying you had disappeared without permission. What happened?" "I'm sorry for skipping school." I was unsure if I should talk about Bill. Mr. Wilson and Mrs. Wilson were looking at me with very worried expressions. I couldn't lie to these two. That's what I thought. Since I started high school, I've been bullied by a guy named Bill, who was my classmate in elementary school. I told them everything that had happened so far and what happened today. So that's what's been going on. You're strong, Michael. Thank you for telling us. Don't hold back anymore. Rely on us a little more. Michael, feel free to talk about anything, whether it's fun or hard. We're practically family after all. After hearing my story to the end, they said this and comforted me. Since that fight, Bill has been less involved with me. However, one day after work, when I was leaving the convenience store with Jenna as usual, I was called out. The man I never wanted to see here, Bill. Working like this suits a poor guy like you who doesn't have a family. He started to make sarcastic comments to me in front of Jenna. I silently glared back at Bill. Suddenly, there was a yell. "What are you doing, Bill?" Bill was smacked hard on the back of the head by a furious man. Startled, Bill spun around. "Dad!" Turned out the man was Bill's father. While Bill was too shocked to say anything, his father came up to me and apologized. I got a call from Mr. Wilson recently. He told me that my son, Bill, has been bullying you. Michael, I can't believe he's doing such terrible things. I'm truly sorry. The story didn't end there. Actually, we owe a lot to Mr. Wilson. We run a liquor store, and when Bill was in first grade, I had a traffic accident while returning from a delivery. 2 people died in that accident. The 2 people who died were your parents, Michael. Bill, standing next to his father, spat out the words. The sudden revelation of this truth left my head spinning. Bill's father looked down for a moment, then raised his face and continued. Your parents, Michael, ran into the street against a red light to save a small child. I wasn't speeding, but I couldn't avoid them because of the sudden event. I'm truly sorry. Bill's father seemed to be suffering greatly, and I could see his arms trembling with tension. People around me suspected I was speeding. I was already in shock from causing the accident, and being doubted made me physically and mentally devastated. The people who helped me out that time were Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. Here's a summary of the rest of the story. In this accident, Bill's father asked Mr. Wilson for legal assistance. Apparently, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were seniors from Bill's father's college club and had known him well for a long time. They listened to his story with great empathy, gathered evidence piece by piece that this accident was unavoidable, and dealt with it. Thanks to them clearing up the misunderstanding, he was able to live with his family and continue the liquor store. He was deeply grateful to Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. However, after the accident, false rumors spread, and the family couldn't go outside for a while. Customers stopped coming to the store, and Bill was bullied at school. Bill started talking about these things like a dam bursting. You've been able to return to a normal life because Mr. Wilson helped you, haven't you? Bill's father chastised Bill, but why did they ignore the signal? Dad, who was obeying the rules, was suspected, and I was in pain. Dad is not guilty. It seemed like Bill was venting the frustration he had felt long ago. Bill's father seemed to be in pain, realizing that he had put even a young Bill through a hard time, and knowing that he had been thinking about his welfare. Bill, I'm sorry. You were young, and I thought you had long forgotten about the accident. Let's go home and talk about this slowly, Bill's father said to Bill. Then, with a deep bow to me, he put his hand on Bill's back, and the 2 of them slowly went home. Michael. Jenna, who had been listening to the whole thing, called out to me from behind. Michael, to tell the truth, your parents were protecting me when they had the accident. At Jenna's sudden confession, I was lost for words. According to Jenna, on the day of the accident, she, who was then a first grader, was out walking her pet dog. When she stopped at a crosswalk, her dog suddenly bolted onto the road, startled by a bird that had taken flight. Jenna, having let go of the leash, desperately chased after her dog, and she too ended up on the road. Just then, a loud horn blared and a truck came from Jenna's right. When Jenna came to, a man and a woman were lying next to her. Apparently they were my parents. From an eyewitness, Jenna learned that the 2 had run out after Jenna and her dog, trying to shield them. And later, she learned that the 2 who had saved her had died. Jenna's parents did go to apologize, but Jenna, shocked by the accident, shut herself in for a while. By the time Jenna was finally able to go out again, I as the bereaved, was taken in by relatives and no one was living in the Edwards residence. In the end, Jenna had been living with the frustration of not being able to apologize. When Michael talked about his parents, I thought maybe, and after hearing that person's story, I was sure. I'm really sorry for the late apology. Thanks to Michael's parents, I'm able to live happily. Thank you very much. Jenna bowed deeply. When I got home, I told Mr. and Mrs. Wilson everything I had heard today. I really respect Michael's parents. It's not something anyone can do to risk their lives to protect another person's child. Even while involved in this accident as a lawyer, I've always wanted to at least protect Michael, who was born to such wonderful parents. That's why we decided to take Michael in. It seems that the Wilsons had always been concerned about me, left all alone. There were times when I thought I was unhappy because my parents left me alone. But because my parents lived honorably until the end, I was able to live with the Wilsons, go to high school, work a part-time job, and meet Jenna, who my parents saved. Various elements connected in a single line, and I was certain that I could live strongly from now on. From this day forward, there was no more harassment from Bill. No one would bully me anymore. The atmosphere in the class became harmonious, and I was able to lead the peaceful high school life I had longed for. When I became a senior in high school, I quit my job at the convenience store to focus on college entrance exams. Having heard stories from the college students I met at my job, I decided to go to college. The faculty I want to join is the law department. In the future, I want to become a lawyer like Mr. Wilson and help people. And then in March, I successfully passed the university entrance exam. And Jenna goes to the same university. Actually, we've been dating since our sophomore year of high school. Michael, let's go report our acceptance to the convenience store where you used to work. Saying so, Jenna started running across the riverbank. I don't know if it's fate, but we met. And knowing the past, we've come to cherish ourselves and live with hope for the future. I will continue to live with all my might, proud of my parents who risked their lives to help others. Thinking so, I started running across the riverbank where I used to walk with my parents.